we have a very interesting discussion today, one that I actually wanted to do most of my professional life. Just for the first 10 years, I wished somebody did it to educate me. And now I actually want to do it to discuss this topic for the benefit of the scholarly community. And so we have a person here with us today who is uniquely suited to discuss the topic of the challenges and the inner workings and maybe even the future of the so-called publishing game. So we have here Sjors Yodszdike, who is a very well-published author. So he's played the game as an author, but also an editor. And so currently he's associated with multiple journals, Journal of International Business Studies, first and foremost, at least, of interest to me. But I assume you've done thousands of reviews and probably lots of editorial work for multiple journals, right? So I guess maybe the first question will be, can you explain your role at JIBS? Because you are deputy editor-in-chief, you are the person who signs off and does the final check of the papers, right? Is that
Yes, that's correct. So JIBS is organized in such a way, like many other journals. So it's not just JIBS, it's many other journals are organized in the exact same way. So manuscript arrives, it's being submitted. Then there's one reviewing editor that also includes me. I'm part of that reviewing team. And we basically assess whether this manuscript could potentially make it. So that's the desk reject stage or the desk pass stage.
That's easy, yeah.
That's easy. Then the manuscript, if it's desk passed, it moves on to what we call an area editor or a handling editor. That's the person who handles the manuscript. That person is responsible for inviting reviewers. Some of you have been involved in this process, either as a reviewer or as an author. And what then, at the end of the process, if a paper is conditionally accepted, that's the moment it ends up on my desk.
Okay.
And then I have a final look at it, and that's not to come up with new stuff. That's most of the time not the case. But it's more about, because I see what other type of manuscripts are being published or forthcoming in JIBS, I want to make sure that we relate to other conversations that are going on, or there's a more effective way to communicate the message. So it's much more about editorial work. I'm not going to repeat anything when it comes to, oh, you should have used an alternative estimation method or something. That's the handling editor and the reviewer's job.
So it's the final quality check, suitability check,
yes.
But also you can still provide some additional comments for additional revisions, or maybe...
Well, it's then conditionally accepted, and then there's always some conditions that are stated, and it could range from, well, could you please shorten your introduction a little bit more because it's on the long end, and we would like to shorten it because if it's more focused,
right.
Your message comes across in a more forceful manner. So that's the way I operate.
You have a team, right? So it's not just you alone. So you have people who will help you. Somebody may look at the method specifically. Somebody may.
So that final step as deputy editor, that's where I'm the only one looking at it. Mm-hmm. But in the process before, there's a whole team involved, including some new initiatives that Rosalie Tang introduced when she took over as editor-in-chief of JIBS.
I see. I know you prepared some slides. Do you want to go through them, or should we just have a conversation?
Well, there was one, when I was thinking about this and preparing our conversation, I was thinking, well, we sort of marketed it or said, well, it's a publishing game. And the more I was thinking about it, that's maybe the wrong word. I know that many of us think of it in terms of a game, but the word game also suggests that it's a first of all, it's not a serious thing, but it is a serious thing.
It is a very serious
It's a very serious thing. It also suggests
people it's a matter of
tenure, career. I mean, it's what you want to achieve, right? It's the way you make a career in academia. So the word game is sort of underselling it, and maybe even leads to the wrong ideas. It also has this connotation that I don't like, which is gaming.
Right,
like sort of gaming the system, and that's something that
I do have some questions, because you put it very well, that it's people are trying to game the system, which is not what we want, but unfortunately it happens sometimes.
Yeah, well, maybe we have time to talk about that, because at the end of the day, publishing as such is also a business model. It's a business model for publishers, it's a business model for us as academics, and that means that, and it's run by people, which at the end of the day means that people are going to come up with ideas to game the system.
So how would you like them to frame it instead of the publishing game?
I would
A
say
conversation on
it's
public?
a conversation on publishing. That's how I would put it.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So should I get to my questions?
Yeah,
Or do
of
you have
course.
some opening
No,
remarks?
hit it.
Okay, well, let's get, so again, today we will not be talking about how to publish papers in JIBS or
No.
other elite journals. So enough seminars of that kind. We will be talking about some lesser known issues. Maybe some of them are somewhat controversial or perhaps stressful for some people, but also some are just, behind the scenes operations of journals, editors that people just don't know and often
Yep.
do not appreciate. In fact, if anything, I often hear a lot of complaints, and having been on both sides of the barricade, so to speak, myself, I know that some of those criticisms are unsubstantiated and sometimes even maybe misled or stemming from misunderstandings about how the system works. So, but yeah, let's get into the topic of journal rankings. So one, I'd like to ask how journals are being ranked to begin with. And I know there are all kinds of ranking systems out there, plus many universities have their own rankings, departments have their own rankings, but also what does it mean for researchers? Should we always try to chase the best of the best journals and publish in the top, or should we publish wherever it's easiest to publish? Or so how does this journal rank come into play to begin with?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important question, but it's also an answer it's not a yes or a no, I'm
Exactly,
afraid.
exactly. And in fact, this alone probably can take an hour to discuss.
Yeah, so let me maybe some of my own experiences to just illustrate what I mean. I, Depending on the school where you work, depending on the ambition level you have, depending on the supervisor you work with, or depending on the system in which you operate, the answer is different. So in some systems, and the American system is one of them, the idea is very clearly you aim for the top journals. That's what you aim for. You work for it for a couple of years and you hope to get your papers published over there. In some other systems, and in some European countries, for example, the idea is also the other way around. You can start at lower ranked journals, not the lowest ranked journals, but lower ranked journals, and then work your way up. So if I look back at my career, my own personal career, that's the trajectory that I had. I never consciously designed it like that, but if I look back, that's the process or the trajectory that I went through.
You started low.
I started lower. I didn't immediately aim for top 8 journals and then worked my way through it. But for me, it was also a learning experience.
But so, okay, JIBS is one of the highest ranked journals overall and definitely number one in international business. So how was it determined? What went into those calculations? Why in some rankings it's number one? So is it all about impact factor? Is it about something else? Is it perceptual? How do those things work?
It's definitely partly perceptual, so perceptions matter. But what has happened, I think it started maybe 35, 40 years ago, is that some groups of academics started to come up with ways to measure and rank journals. And then you need metrics.
Right.
So one of the very first metrics that was invented was the idea, okay, then we could check how often articles are cited.
Right.
So that led to the impact factor that we now know, which is basically out of the, let's say, so many papers that are published in a year, how often are these cited? So it's the number of citations that an average article published in a journal receives. Fast forward to 2025, the system got a little bit out of hand, if you want to say, because the same impact factors are used to rank individuals, to rank groups, and it was never the original goal.
H index, I index.
Yeah. So, and these are all derivatives of the same basic idea. Can you come up with a metric that sort of ranks a set of journals? Now, the problem with that was
that's exactly my question,
so the problem with that system is that you can start, if you talk about gaming, that's where you can start to game the system. So journals can find ways to sort of artificially increase their impact factor. So if you go back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there were some journals that said, well, it's only the papers that are in print that count in this metric. So why don't I just already publish the papers on the website? They start to collect citations. And then by the time they appear in print, they appear in print, but by the time they're published, they already have 10 or 5 citations. So there's new rules, new ways of countering this, and then a couple of years later, this idea of this way of gaming the system is no longer possible. But I think the biggest problem that many people have and don't fully realize is that citations to all journals across the sciences are highly skewed. So you've got a limited number of articles published in journals, and they're responsible for the bulk of the citations to that particular journal. So it's very risky to start evaluating individuals on the basis of an impact factor of a journal. It's not the same.
This whole issue of self-citations, both by individuals citing their own papers, but by journal editors requiring citations to publications in their own journal.
Yep.
Is that one of those problems?
Yep, that could be one of those problems. So without mentioning journals, I know that there have been journals out there where they, if you increase the number of self-citations, that was another way of gaming the system years ago. But again, then the organization that calculates these metrics then says, well, you know what, we're going to exclude self-citations from the metric. So over time, the metric, the possibilities to game that metric have reduced. It's no longer as.
I remember the time when editors would ask me before accepting the paper, can you cite a few more papers from our journal? And now it's the opposite. They say, can you reduce the number?
Yep.
Because we will be penalized.
Yep.
But again, going back to the determining the impact and quality based on journal rank, using citation count as such metric.
Yeah.
Couldn't it be sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy? You know, we cite better publications in better journals because we think they're better, but because of that, they get even more citations. Yep. And then.
Absolutely. So that's why it's also so difficult. If you look back and take the last 10, 15, 20 years, the list of journals that are generally considered top journals in our field 20 years ago is more or less the same as the list of journals that are considered top in 2025. It's very difficult for new journals to come in and then work their way to the top.
Okay. Yeah, one of the challenges we just went through the process of revising our annual review policies. And so there was a big discussion about which journals we count and how much. And so I publish mostly in international business. And so at this school, FT50 counts more than anything else. So if it's on FT50, that's a good journal. We even get a substantial actually payment for publishing in those journals. The problem is that there is only JIBS on that list. So for IB, that's my only choice. Mm-hmm. For general management, you have several. For ROB, you have several. For accounting, you have several. Seems unfair to me, but then what do we do? So
there's nothing we can do.
Business, for management on that list, I don't know.
Well, there's a whole range. So in your school, it's the FT50 that counts. In some other schools, it's the UT Dallas list, which is, I think, a little bit more restrictive than the FT50 list. In some other schools, especially in Europe and the UK, definitely it's the UK ABS list. So the list that is used by business schools, with the 4-star, the 4 and the 3, 2 and 1 level journals. But my experience having been in this job and having been involved in this as research director at different institutions is that you can think of a whole range of metrics, but if you take the common denominator across all these metrics, you more or less get the same list of journals showing up. You're going to have some variation on the fringes, but that's about it. And we sort of intuitively also know what are the top journals.
Well, I remember years ago we were sitting in the conference room next door talking to our dean at that time, asking, so what should be on the list? And he said, oh, come on, you kind of know what good journals are, right? And so you don't really need a ranking for that, which is true to some extent. But then also, and again, I hope I recall the story correctly. So Anne Will Hartz and her quality list. So a long time ago, it could have been even the AUM conference in Hawaii, whenever it was, like literally more than a decade ago. She shared with me a story as to what prompted her to create her catalog of journals. She said she was applying for tenure, and I believe at that time it was in Australia. And so her dilemma was that some of her most cited work was not even in journals, it was a book chapter or book chapter.
Yeah.
And she started looking at citation counts, just trying to make the case that some of her work published not in those top journals should count as much, if not more, than publications in top journals. And that's when she started looking at all those citations, and that's when she created the initial list, and then she's been updating it. Thank you so much. We actually worked with those documents very much a lot as we were revising our annual review policies, and then the publisher parish software.
Yep.
But so how do we then deal with this quality measures if some of the most impactful work may be books or book chapters, or maybe not even?
I think I've always tried to operate in a context, and I'd love to work in a university setting where those kind of intellectual contributions are still considered an intellectual contribution. Right. So the idea of working, but again, that works for me. Other people have different opinions on this, but for me, it wouldn't work very well if I would be operating in a context where book chapters don't count, books don't count. The challenge is, I think that's where the real challenge is. So when you think about how do you evaluate what we do in our work, well, the easiest, but probably the worst way of doing it is just get an overview from Google Scholar where someone has been publishing, and then rank the journals based on some kind of a journal rank, and then give it a number, give it a score. I fundamentally believe in that if you want to evaluate people's work, you should read their stuff.
Right.
And maybe you find out that that particular book chapter is really an intellectual contribution.
Right.
And that richness gets a little bit lost, or some would even put it in stronger words, it would say gets totally lost, the moment you start to focus only on a narrow set of journals and a narrow set of metrics.
I once was given a presentation at a university, one of the major schools, no need to name it. And after my presentation, I met with the department chair, and he said that in our department, we count only 4 journals. And he lists those journals, and he says, I tell my faculty, if you tried all 4 and you didn't publish, don't even waste your time on submitting it to the 5th journal, move on to the next paper. That is very restrictive. I suspect it also creates some stress. It maybe also prompts people to shoot for the highest quality work.
Yep.
But yes, I mean that's an extreme. But
that's an extreme strategy, and I think the reality is that most schools that perform relatively well and where people also experience a certain degree of well-being when working there are the schools where this is balanced.
So at your school, so we do have a balance. Quality and quantity matters, even though the financial rewards or bonuses come only with FT50 publications, but we count everything. Although at our school, there is a limit on how much credit you get for publications in lower tiers. So basically up until some level, we have a point system. It's no more than 1 point. Next level, no more than 2 points, and only in the top category.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
So is it similar at your school at this time? Again, those who don't know, Sjoerd is arguably at the world's best international business school. Based on most of the rankings, you guys definitely top 3 in the world, probably number 1. So again, when it comes to my field, I'm curious how it's set up at your school.
Yeah, well, we try to read stuff. Mm-hmm. So we really try to stick to this culture of reading the work that people have done. So when evaluating people, it's not just, we don't just calculate what people have done, because then a computer could do the job, right?
Which sadly happens too often at many schools, but yes.
Yeah, so I think it's really, really important to keep this richness, as difficult as it is. That doesn't mean, so let's move to the entire other end of this continuum. It doesn't mean that these journal rankings have no meaning. They do have meaning. They mean something. So the idea that then anything goes and we should just completely ignore all these journal rankings, that's also nonsense. True. So what you want to do is a sort of balanced approach where you say, okay, we have these journals. These journals we know are the better journals or the top journals. But if someone next to that is able to publish other pieces, engages with an intellectual debate in our field, that's great, right?
And again, I've heard some stories how AI would generate almost a random collection of words and the papers get published in some journals. I know that wouldn't be possible at JIBS, right?
No,
absolutely.
No. Maybe we get to talk more extensively about AI, because I think that's gonna
Actually, we may
completely.
get at some point, but what I mean is there is absolutely no way of a low quality journal being first, I've never seen one, for example, published in JIBS, but also knowing how the process works, it would have to be half a dozen of people completely neglecting their duty.
Yeah, there's so many steps in that whole process. I cannot imagine, although I'm careful here because AI has become so good and it's become so sophisticated that I should be careful how I put it. But at this point in time, I cannot imagine that.
Well, but if a paper written by AI gets published in JIBS, it's not because you didn't do your work. It's because AI did such a good job that it was.
Well, that's a nice way to put it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get to AI separately. So tell us also more, especially for those younger colleagues here watching, what are open access journals and what are predatory journals?
Oh, that's a very good question. And by the way, also let me define them first, but then we get to talk about it because especially the predatory journals have improved so much. So predatory journals are journals that publish manuscripts. They first of all they want you to pay for it. Mm-hmm. So upon submission, you're expected to pay a fee. And second of all, there's not really a quality check. So they publish without the proper review process.
As long as you pay?
Almost as long as you pay. So there's no or very limited quality control. And the business model is that people think that they can get a publication and they get a publication, but it's in a predatory journal. It's low quality. I would say it adds probably zero to the intellectual debate. But the business model at the other end is making money. So that's what is predatory journal. Now, everyone probably remembers or gets these emails of these journals and in, let's say 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you could easily see it and you deleted them in a split second. So it was not really a concern. But these emails have become so professional that sometimes I actually have to read through the email to see, okay, what's happening here? Is this a real invitation? Is this a predatory journal? What's going on here? So if you're not very experienced in this world, then that's where predatory journals operate, right?
I completely agree. This happened to us at our university just a couple of weeks ago. We had a student that presented at AIB her master's thesis, and she was presented with this. And so she was excited. We're on the pathway to putting it in a different space, but it looked good. When she forwarded it to me, it was a little unsettling.
Yeah. No, so
a young scholar would be excited about this invitation.
Exactly. And one way to... The easiest way, if you don't really know how to deal with this, and if this is a predatory journal, there's some online repositories with overviews of predatory journals, but they change, right? The business model of these journals is that they change all the time. The other way to look at it is if you take what I think is one of the most extensive lists of journals that are real journals, that would be the ABCD list from Australia or the ABS list from the UK. If it's not on there, you can be certain it's not a predatory journal. Yeah. But it's not the same as open access. So that's where it gets confusing.
And so the rise of those journals was prompted by many countries just simply demanding publications anywhere, any publication?
Yes. So the moment that the business model becomes for making a career anywhere in the world, universities have implemented this idea of you need to publish. Well, then if a publication is required, then all of a sudden you get a market emerging of what we now call predatory journals.
So we what's the title on the folio of rewarding for A while hoping for B? So you hope for quality research, but you reward for publishing.
Yes,
and
that's where it goes wrong, right? And in general, I think we should, yes, of course you should reward for publishing, but I think research is about academic debate, of which conferences, journals, workshops are all mechanisms to organize it. Now, we almost exclusively reward journal publications because we think that that's the only thing and the measurable outcome. Peer-reviewed journal publications, but it's part of a communication system.
Yeah. Now, open access publication, that's different, right? So when my paper is accepted, the journals almost all now say, would you like to pay anywhere from $500 to $5,000 to publish it as open access? Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so that's not the same as a predatory journal. Yeah. So this is a completely different discussion. So open access is when you go online, you go to any journal and you would like to get access to it, and very often you hit a firewall.
Yeah.
It's the publisher's firewall.
If your school is not subscribed or
Exactly.
using your private computer.
Yep, then you have to pay for it. Now, in order to open access basically means that it's completely open and publicly available, but someone has to pay for it. Now, here's where it becomes a bit difficult. So let me try to explain this in the easiest way possible. Publishers used to make money by having these journals, and then they would sell these journals to libraries, university libraries all over the world. And university libraries would then buy a subscription, and that's subscription based. So anyone working at the university that has actually got this subscription would have free, it's not open, would have access to these journals, but outsiders would not have access to that. Under pressure of all kinds of research agencies in the world who started to question this business model of publishers are more and more forced to change that business model of subscriptions to university libraries. And what they're now doing is thinking, okay, can we make it available open access? And then there's a whole new market has emerged in a way ranging from, well, I published my journal, it got accepted in the Journal of Management, Journal of International Business Studies, and now I have the option to make it open access. So I can pay for it myself.
You basically prepay the subscription for this particular article for the whole world.
Exactly. In some countries, the government, very often countries where there's state universities, in some countries, the government has taken care of it. So if you work at some schools all schools in the Netherlands have this system where let's say the collective group of Dutch universities have agreed that all these journals are on their open access list. So that means for me, if I happen to work at such a university, I'm the corresponding author, and I publish in a journal, and that journal is on that list of this collective agreement, then I don't even have to pay it myself because the research agency has already paid for it.
I see some of my co-authors on the list there, and there is one particular who has paid for open. So she is in Europe, and so we got a couple of papers accepted, and she says, I have money to pay for open access. I'm like, oh, that's nice. So what's the incentive for the researcher? More citations?
More citations. It's very clear. There's clear evidence that if a paper is available open access, citations will go up.
People will read it more, and yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now let's talk about a little bit more about the economics of publishing. So who pays for what? So we talked about the open access. In some fields, I know there is a submission fee. So in our field, international business management, usually if the journal charges to submit a paper, that's a bad sign. So probably predatory journal. In economics, for example, or some natural sciences, I know there is a submission fee. So that's one financial point. And then also there is a publication fee at some journals. So how does it work? Do you know much about differences across fields? In our field, usually the author doesn't pay, but doesn't get paid either by the journal. So you do the work, you transfer the publishing rights to the publisher, but you as the author don't get really anything for it.
No, you don't get anything. Indeed, you're right. In management in general, there is no tradition that you pay a small fee, a submission fee. In some journals, in some fields, you pay a submission fee of $50 or $100 or euros. So these are typically small amounts, and the background or the idea behind it is that if you charge a small fee, then people will think more carefully before submitting. So it reduces the number of semi-blind submissions to a journal, which just cause a lot of work and are typically not very well done.
Sure.
But it also means, and that's the reason why I think in management and definitely in IB and in JIBS, we don't charge it, because it's also a hurdle. And not everyone has the ability to pay $50 or $100 upon submission. So you create a hurdle, and some countries or some researchers in richer countries may be able to pay for it, whereas others will not be able to pay for it. Exactly.
And we are not as much on grants, in natural sciences and economics, they tend to have larger grants, and probably that is covered by the grant. But so who else gets paid or doesn't get paid? So I know reviewers are not paid in our
No.
field, though in some fields they are.
In some fields, I know in finance, there's some fields where you get again, we're talking about small, relatively small numbers, right? $100, maybe $200, $250 for a review on time. In the management IB world, editors are not paid, reviewers are not paid, and we don't charge a submission fee.
I guess it's a good exercise. I always recommend my younger colleagues and students to do reviews when invited. It's a good exercise.
Yes.
At the same time, especially younger colleagues ask, why should I do it? It does take time. And so, how many reviews is enough per year? So that's a good question, especially if you're not paid for it.
No, exactly. And that's also depends on where you are at what stage in your career. But I would say you start with reviewing for conferences.
Right.
That's a very easy, low profile way to start. Get to learn from, because you also get to see the reviews of the other reviewers, and you can actually learn from that. That's a very powerful way to do it. And you work your way up, and at some point, you get an ad hoc review request by a very good journal.
At some point, too many of those.
No, of course. And once you get more senior, then you actually have to shield yourself a little bit from it, because it's look, if you do the math, a journal like JIBS receives, but it's the same for some other top journals, receives more than 1,000 manuscripts a year. If we let's take 50% reject rate at the desk stage. That means that 500 manuscripts have to be sent out. If each manuscript requires 3 reviewers, we're looking at 1,500 individuals who have to be approached. Experts in a particular field.
Not random people.
No, so this whole system it very much relies on people's willingness to contribute to the community.
I enjoy the process. I review about 30 or so per year, so like one every other week. It's an educational process, but it does take time. And obviously not being paid. And I guess for my annual review, it would have been enough just to do 5 a year. So I would still get the same points, so to speak. But anyway, editors. So I know some journals started paying small honorarium, usually $500 in the United States, for the reason that it's considered up to $500. You don't have to report it to the IRS. But so it's more of a kind of little thank you note. So I think 2 journals pay something like that to me. So it's a nice bonus. It's definitely, if you count per hour, it's not even a minimum wage. But so still editors, including editors-in-chief, they don't have like a real salary at the journal, right?
No, the idea that you're receiving a real salary, I'm not aware of. There might be some editors-in-chiefs of some particular journals who would receive some sort of a stipend to travel the world, to deal with the costs that they make, represent the journal, but don't think in terms of salaries.
Yeah, definitely. You cannot make money on
it. No.
Although, again, being an editor, I mean, would you say it's benefited you in many ways, developmental?
Yes. Absolutely.
Like, what are the benefits if anyone ever became or got an invitation? The time, so to speak?
Yes. For me, the answer is a clear yes. I've benefited tremendously. I like doing it. Of course, it's a lot of work, but one of the things I really, really like is that over the years, I think I developed a pretty good overview of the field. And that's, from an intellectual point of view, that's the part I really appreciate.
And especially, again, in your role, you sort of, I'm glad that this position exists, sort of final quality check, suitability. It's an interesting, probably the most intellectually challenging part of the process, right? So it's not just looking at the reviews. Okay, 3 recommend rejection, probably a rejection. So it's much more in-depth analysis.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, it's with the field of IB is so broad. So we got papers that deal with international finance, marketing, the strategy, not to forget the strategy group. So what it means is that you constantly, you can't just read a manuscript and think, okay. You really have to be super sharp and focused, because it's never standard.
Tell me about, so we talked a little bit about AI as the author, now AI as the reviewer. I see more and more reviews that I can recognize have been, at the very least, copy edited by AI, but possibly also, given that they tend to be somewhat shallower, so to speak, they're very well written and they're extensive, but at the same time, they may miss some things I know are problematic. And so they focus more on the form rather than the substance. So do you get many of those? How much a problem is it? Or maybe it's an opportunity. Maybe we shouldn't bother those 1,500 people with reviews and just ask AI to do the initial check.
I don't think AI can do the reviews
Mhm.
as good as many of our professionals and academics can do them. Having said so, I know that many people use AI also to improve their English language.
Yeah.
We work globally. Not everyone's, I'm Dutch. You can hear it from my accent. I'm not native. So to use AI or to use tools in general to improve your English language, I would say that's a good thing. Everyone can benefit from that. But you're spot on when it comes to reviews. The reviews that I've seen that have been generated with AI, you see it. It's more shallow, it's fluffy, and it remains at a certain level and it doesn't go in depth.
Yeah, it seems to be more about the form.
Yes.
Maybe flow, but it would miss, like it wouldn't.
And it would come up with these standard cookie cutter type of sentences like, well, maybe you could specify your research question a bit better, or your introduction could be more focused. Well, that's not helping authors.
So some of the other challenges of the publishing game, so one of them being the sort of the bias in favor of, gee, that's interesting results or significant results, and the
Yeah.
other way around, it's hard to publish papers or studies that have no effect, even though some
Yeah.
say they're important. Replications tend to be not as much favored as interesting studies. And then this whole story of the replication crisis, whatever
Yeah.
that means. Can you tell us more about the context of this whole phenomenon?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things here that
Yeah.
we need to distinguish. So one thing is the discussion on the reproducibility crisis, as some people have called it, and that goes back to the question: okay, if a paper is published and it has used data, we should, from a scientific point of view, we should be able to reproduce. It's not the same as replicate, but reproduce what's being done
Yeah.
there. So what does that mean? That means that we should have access to the data. Well, that triggers a follow-up question. Well, how do we get access to the data? Now, in some journals, this has become possible. In some other journals, it's more challenging, and it doesn't always have to do with a lack of willingness, but sometimes it's just, maybe we can talk about it a little bit later, but there's a whole bunch of operational issues that kick in once you start to do this. So the reproducibility crisis relates to the idea, okay, if a paper is published, from a scientific point of view, I should be able to reproduce the results, or replicate it, maybe using an alternative database. Now, then we move into the other part of the discussion, which has to do with science and scientific progress is based on the idea not just reproducing what someone else has done, but building on top of that. And that might mean replicating these results, but maybe in a totally different context. Or replicating these results, but with a radically different sample, which is interesting for so-and-so theoretical reasons. So, and then you might get a discussion between papers that were originally published, replications of these original studies, extensions of these original studies. That's relatively new. We haven't really.
What I guess I wanted to nudge you into talking about is with the pressure to publish and the bias to publish studies that
Novel.
found interesting, novel. Yeah. People seem to get sometimes creative, sometimes probably just forging the data. I mean, we've heard enough stories, but in some cases, sort of torturing the data until they confess in semi-legal ways, cherry picking, questionable deletion of outliers, whatever other techniques, adding a few more controls, dropping a few controls, massaging the model until you get what you want to get. And so as a result, you sort of get statistically significant findings. If you use, or if I got access to the same data set, I would get the same results. There is no mathematical error in this. But if I wanted to replicate the study using a similar sample, similar study design, I may not get the same results. And so we've heard enough lately. There has been this whole debate going on in behavioral economics. So those guys have had a bunch of problems from
psychology. I think more than 10 years ago in psychology where
So do we have anything like that in management? Is that as much of a problem? Are we also pressured to find results to publish?
I don't have a reason to think that management would be different from behavioral economics or from psychology. I think there's no reason why we would be different. I think that's the same set of standards, the same overall rules apply, and it also triggered the same kind of behavior. What makes it so? It's in some fields, political science, economics, sociology, all the top journals have basically said, whenever you publish in our journal, we want you to make the data and everything that comes with it fully available. Now, there's shades of gray there. Sometimes it's we want you to make it available to the editorial team as a final check. Some journals would say, no, we want you to just upload the full database on the website of the journal or in a data repository, such that other people can reproduce what you've done. If you think that is serving as a sort of police force idea to make sure that people don't engage in unethical behavior, I think we should not be naive. That's not right. what you're going to achieve. What you're going to achieve is you're improving the possibility for other people to reproduce results, to engage in scholarly debate. That part will be covered and will improve if you make data available. I think it's very difficult to use that system to rule out unethical behavior. If people are really trying to game the system and massage data or leave data out, there will be opportunities. This is just fraud, right? I mean, we're talking about fraud.
Well, again, so I believe Herman Augenis published extensively on how to detect questionable behaviors.
Yeah.
But also, he would provide in many of his articles sort of legitimate ways to improve your statistical significance, let's call it this way. And sometimes, yes, it's defensible.
Yep.
As I said, you can be a little with the sampling.
Yeah, but it goes back to the almost age-old question: what do you do with this particular outlier? You have one outlier in your database, and is that a relevant outlier that is worth full discussion? You should always disclose it, right? So, but is it then part of your sample, or is it such an out of sample observation that you should take it out? Well, but the only answer to that question is be transparent about it and discuss it and explain it. And then if you explain your decision to include it or exclude it, then we can have a debate about it. But I think that's where it starts.
There was this case described in the book called Reinvent and Discovery. The book is more about large-scale collaboration, but they talk about how in genetics research, there was this, what they called the Bermuda Agreement. The Bermuda Agreement. So apparently I think it was the plant genetics scientists who met in the Bermuda somewhere at the conference. And so they agreed that from now on, all of the data used to publish in our main journals will be available freely. And then animal genetics, they didn't do it. And so while it didn't, probably reduce the amount of fraud, but this public sharing led to all kinds of collaboration.
Yes.
And so people would look at your data, may see something there that you didn't see it. They approach you and say, hey, Sjoerd, interesting study. Did you notice this? So before you know it, new discoveries are made.
I think that's also in physics. That's the way people operate. And this is so not a tradition in management and international business. But
why not? So why would, for example, not make that a requirement?
Well, we have the requirement that handling editors can always ask for the data, and they can ask for additional analyses and see the actual raw output of the regression analysis if it's a regression-based analysis. But I think one of the first hurdles that you bump into is that people it has taken years during the PhD to collect the data. And then upon the first publication, people are asked to share the data, make it publicly available. Now, there's ways around this. You can say, well, we'll make it available with a 5-year embargo. So it becomes available in 5 years' time. The other thing,
so you're talking about, I make my data available. I have 5 more papers in mind based on the data. And then somebody publishes it before I can.
Yeah. So that's, of course, well, you've invested all this time and energy, money to get data. And then upon your first publication, you want to capitalize on that. And then with your first publication, you're asked to put it on a website.
Give up your R&D.
And give up all your R&D efforts. So that's one issue, but I think there's ways around it. The other thing is that for a journal in management, so if you're in a particular area, in a particular field where it's the same type of data and the same type of methods are used, it's easier for an editorial team to organize it behind the scenes, that there is sort of a mechanism where people can check what's going on. But if you take management and if you take JIBS, the methods used range from experimental design, qualitative research, large-scale secondary data, but they're proprietary by Bureau van Dijk or you name it. So it's not as easy as it sounds to make the data available. It sounds great, and I'm a great fan of it, but between what you would want to and between what is realistic, there's really some real hurdles.
Well, from my field, I would say that an interesting example here is data on cultural values. So Hofstede infamously didn't really share his data. I'm not sure how much it was due to the problems with the data itself or because it was proprietary. I didn't want it to be shared. But in any case, World Value Survey, they always made their data available, no restrictions. And we have literally hundreds, if not thousands, of publications based on the World Value Survey, whereas Hofstede's data essentially has been used, in a few papers by himself and his co-authors and nothing else. So what's the sort of return on investment? Again, I don't know, there could have been some legal constraints. It was data from a company as opposed to collected by collaborators of the World Value Survey.
But you're right. And both of us are in the field of culture research and comparative cultural analysis. I always like the World Value Survey for that particular reason, because it's publicly available. You can exactly replicate or reproduce what others have done. So from a learning point of view, it's also great. So when I was a junior scholar, I was trying to reproduce what other people had done using that same database. There's one thing that I think matters here. So we tend to think in terms of a publication is the paper, and that's for which you get credit. So you get cited, and that not only I get one citation, but it means that people are building on your work. But with databases, if you upload your data in a well-established repository, you also get a digital object identifier.
That's actually what I wanted to ask you. So technically, we don't really get full credit for publishing data, and many of us are sitting on data sets that we would be willing to give up. They would be still usable.
But you can. So you would have to upload that database, for example, at Harvard repository. It would get a DOI, so a digital object identifier, the same like a journal publication. But now it could be that suppose you've done that, Vaz. You published a paper and you also made the data publicly available. Maybe I'm not citing your paper, but maybe I am citing your database. So you still get credits for that database.
Yeah, I can totally see how some people can get more citations for data than for the actual papers.
Yes.
Somehow that culture is still not fully developed in our field, which is almost too bad. Most of us have, like, for example, Karen will be defending her dissertation in 3 weeks. And I'm sure you'll have multiple papers out of that specific data set based on the dissertation, but I suppose it could be shared with the world. Why not? But I don't think you'll get quite as much credit for that as for the papers that you publish.
It makes me think too about the X-Culture database. So in thinking about your page and all the publications, you've got dozens, maybe hundreds, but can you even quantify how many papers have used X-Culture data?
And so one of the challenges for us becomes, if we make the data completely, available, like the World Value Survey, where I don't even know who uses them. One concern is that, as you said, we invest so much time in collecting data. And let's say, for example, the three of us decide to write a paper about, the effect of cultural intelligence on conflicts in teams. But the data are freely available to the world, and someone in, France wrote the same papers 2 weeks or published 2 weeks before we finish ours. And so all that year of work, for example, that we spend, in a way goes to waste because somebody published it happens a lot, by the way, with meta-analytic studies. So my good co-author and friend Pierce Steele once, a long time ago in Calgary, wrote a paper, actually a meta-analysis, just to find out that somebody published almost the same meta-analysis just a few weeks earlier. And then he had to add many more layers of stuff. He still published it in a top journal. I think it was Psychological Bulletin. But yes, essentially all that work was like, oops, somebody just did essentially what I was trying to do. But tell me, so going back to this reproducibility crisis, so what's this deal with pre-registration studies or studies that
that's in response to this reproducibility crisis. So the idea is that with experimental design, one major issue was that you set up the experiment, here's the outcome, but we don't know how, very simple question, how many experiments will run until this result was achieved. So transparency about the setup of the experiment, how many runs. So that became known, or is known, under the heading of you need to pre-register your experiment. That came out of psychology. We in management, the number of experimental studies is limited. But in those cases, we would like to ask people to pre-register. So stick to the standards that are now completely accepted and standard in psychology.
Now, but there is a sort of two sides to that story. On the one hand, you want people to pre-register so that they follow the protocol.
Yeah.
They don't get too creative
Yes.
with trying to get the significant results. But also, isn't it the case that some journals say, as long as we like your research design, as long as we approve the design, we will publish the results no matter what the results are.
So this goes back to the question you asked before. So what about null results, right? So sometimes you get results that there are no significant results, but your design was excellent, your theory is excellent, but it's just not there. That's a finding. And journals are biased, I think, in general, towards publishing significant results. So out of that, or part of the discussion on pre-registration and reproducibility, was emerged the discussion on, well, wait a minute, what we could do as a policy for a journal would be, you hand in a proposal where you say, this is going to be my theoretical argument, this is going to be my design. Some journals have then said, okay, that's approved. So if you do this and you do it in the correct way, whatever the result will be, we'll publish it. So that takes out this pressure to
get too creative with outliers.
Yes, exactly,
et cetera.
and to go for only significant results. Because one way to look at it, the way I look at it, is that it's a bit, take two steps back, right? It's a bit interesting, to use that word. If you, across the board, in many management journals, almost all the hypotheses are always confirmed or supported.
Which is a challenge, yeah.
Well, that basically would mean that social scientists we're apparently able to predict the future, right? That's another way to look at it. I mean, if we're perfectly able to predict the future with a 100% hit rate, well, that's naive. Yeah.
Well, one of the ways we know that sometimes people get creative with this kind of analysis is that when you look at correlations that were hypothesized versus correlations that were not the focal part of the study, but were reported in the correlation table. So you would have the same two variables, but there is a big difference in the correlation significance size, depending on whether you had the incentive to prove that it's there versus when you don't really care.
Yeah. No, so it's the file drawer problem, right?
Well, let me talk about something else that is, again, kind of controversial, and I'm just curious here. What your thoughts are. I do have my opinion, and it may actually diverge from yours. The obsession of our field with theory. So one of the frequent reasons for rejecting papers is that your theory is not strong enough or not enough theory. And so people in some other fields sometimes even make fun of us for theory. Like, for example, in natural sciences, they are perhaps not as concerned with theory. And as long as you find an effect, I'm not kidding you, one of the major chemistry journals once published a paper, I have a copy, called The Effects of Chicken Poop on Electroconductivity of Graphene. And the study was, they had different breeds of chicken, and they literally used poop of different breeds of chicken, mixed it with graphene, measured electrical conductivity, and some broiler, whatever the breed was, improved electrical conductivity by 10%, and that's a big improvement, and that's what they published. That's probably a little too primitive, but there was no theory, there was no, we just we found a way to improve conductivity. In JIBS, no way you would publish a paper without strong theoretical underpinning, right?
No. So let's distinguish between what official editorial policy practices and my own personal opinion. So I think it's going to be very hard to publish a paper in JIBS, but let's face it, in any management journal, exactly as you say, without any theory in it.
Well, we do have some journals that specifically publish exploratory work, right?
Sure. But and
yes,
and there
AMJ,
many of the top journals, they would say, well, we need at least some sort of a theoretical argument there. My own perspective on it is, well, first of all, there's a logic to that, right? So why we do what we do because we're trying to explain phenomena around us. If we're gonna give up on our ambition to explain what's going on in the world, then you should quit this job. And in order to do that, we're trying to come up with causal theoretical arguments. We're trying to come up with a framework. I'm going to be loose in my terminology here. You want to have a framework that explains, okay, if trying to explain this phenomena, this set of arguments helps to understand what's going on. So the overall ambition to try to aim for developing such a framework, I think that should be our ambition. The question is if in each individual, so the question is it at the level of an individual paper, or is that at the level of a field or a level of a set of papers? The way I personally think about it is ideally this theoretical advancement is at the level of a field or at a set of studies. I agree with you that we've become a little bit obsessed, maybe too strong words, but focused on making a theoretical contribution in each individual paper. I don't think that's always realistic, and I also don't think that's always needed. The reality is that if you send manuscripts out for reviewers, even if as an editor you might think, okay, the theory might be, it's more the empirical contribution that really matters here. The feedback for the reviewers is very often, where's the theory? So then
and how much is enough?
And how much is enough? Yeah. So I know that in some other fields, exactly as you say, but not even that far away. So in finance, economics, it's much more accepted and acceptable to start with an empirical question. Say, well, why does this happen, or how does this happen? And I want to explore this in this data set. So it's more exploratory.
Well, so let me explore this topic a little bit more. So the concern may not even be so much whether or not there is a theory, the answer to the question why. The concern seems to be, when we talk about the publishing game, the concern seems to be that often when we say theory, we mean citing a theory with a name by some old dead scientist. So unless it's like Mendenhall 1964 signaling something theory, it doesn't count. So you can explain the logic, you can theorize yourself.
Yeah.
Like you explain why you believe A affects B, but many editors and reviewers will not see that as valid theory. They will say, well, that's your logical explanation, but what's the theory? And unless you cite some, as I said, old paper with the theory name in, it almost doesn't count.
But there's a risk. I don't fully agree with you here.
Okay, and I'm very, very happy to hear that.
Because what you're trying to do as a field, as a community, is you're trying to develop a framework, a theory, a model, whatever exact word you want to use, collectively. So it really doesn't make any sense. It's a waste of everyone's time if you, not you personally, but if you were to develop a paper with your own arguments and you would not relate those arguments to what we already know. And I think that's actually a real risk. I see that as a real risk, that we're trying to, there's a tendency sometimes to introduce new concepts, new terminology. Whereas if you know the literature, you think, well, this word may not have been used, but theoretically, these arguments are not new at all. And then you would, so the risk is, if as a field, if you start to allow for that, and if you don't force authors to basically build on the shoulders of giants, and I'm saying not giants in terms of individual people, but the shoulders of what other people have done, then there's no structure in the development of an overarching theory of the field. And I think that's really important. I think we really run the risk. So when I train my PhD students, I always tell them, I don't want you to only look at the last 5 years of what's been published and only appears on Google Scholar. I also want you to go back to some of the book chapters in the books that were written in the 60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah, and actually you touch upon a very salient issue for me. You've done many meta-analyses. I've done some. So as the saying goes, a sign of a mature field is agreed upon terminology.
Yes.
And in our field, we don't seem to have that well developed. You often would see the same construct appear under different names. Sometimes the same name would be applied to all kinds of different
Yep.
constructs. So looking for the literature sometimes can be quite torturous because people will name the same thing in so many different
Well,
ways.
you start to realize that when you start to do meta-analysis, because you're forced to actually put a label or a
Right.
code on a particular construct. But I think as editors, and now I put on my head as an editor, one of my tasks is that this doesn't get out of hand. So what I consider my task is to make sure that whenever a paper comes in, that it taps into this ongoing models, constructs, and that it's clear that if it deviates in a particular way. And it's transparent how it extends or builds upon what's being done. But I think the real risk of this idea that anything goes is that we, as a field, well, what are we doing then?
Yeah. Well, a lot of papers and editorials on what is theory and what theory is not. But one of the more known papers starts with the story anecdote by the author who says that he was presenting his research at a major Ivy League school. And so he said, I have an interesting, important research question. I have the data, I have the results, practically important, applicable, but I don't have a good theory. And he says there are a few dozen people in the audience. A couple of them are Nobel Prize laureates, and everybody, and I think the language was, go into their mental archives trying to remember a theory that can explain the findings. And so all of that is done sort of retroactively because, technically you should have a theory, then you formulate your hypotheses, then you collect the data. Here you already have the results and you are going through the mental archive of theories trying to find one that explains what you found. So based on how you described it, it doesn't seem to be much of a problem because it's almost like you try to weave it into the existing.
Yeah, so I think, well, there's a difference between running your analyses and then retrofitting something you found into a framework. I mean, I would say that's called harking, hypothesizing after results are known.
Although quite common in our field as
well. But I make a distinction between what is called harking. You have some results and you have let me give you a practical example. You have a secondary database, you run some regressions because you happen to have the data, and then ex post, you start to look for a set of arguments. These papers are, by the way, easily recognizable because there's very often a complete misfit between the theoretical constructs and the way these things are measured, because you cannot retrofit certain things, right? That's very difficult. The other way of looking at it is that, look, the purest way that you just described is you develop your theory, you develop your hypothesis, you collect your data, you have a proper research design, you run the regression analysis, and you run it once, and that's your result.
That's your result.
I'm more of and I think that's the reality in our field in social sciences in general, is that you have a back and forth between what your theoretical ideas are and what your data is telling you. And that's not the same as harking. So let's distinguish between that. And I think that's a very healthy way of looking at it. So you're trying to
let your data tell the story.
Well, you need to know the data. You're trying to figure out what's going on in the data, and that at the same time, what goes on in your mind is you're sharpening your theoretical arguments. I think that's a good way of working, and that's not the same as retrofitting your theory to your data.
We are almost out of time, and so I would like to ask maybe for some examples of maybe anecdotes, stories, cases from your own editorial career or maybe author career when related to the publishing. What was the title? Not the publishing. The
conversation on publishing.
Conversation on publishing. So any interesting cases that you've encountered?
Yeah, well,
maybe
so first of all,
reasons you rejected papers for or accepted papers for, or
well, one thing that happened recently, so that's the first thing that pops up, is that I served as a reviewer of a particular manuscript. So it was not in my role as an editor, I served as a reviewer. And I wrote my review. I so voluntarily put in time and effort, uploaded the review, and then get a message by the editor a few weeks later. This paper was rejected, and here are the other reviews. So, okay, fine. Then 2-3 weeks later, I receive another review invitation, and it happens to be the same manuscript, No changes made.
From a different journal.
From a different journal, no changes made, and asked me to review it again. So I said, well, so I write the editor, said, I've seen this paper before, I'm happy to review it, and I can upload my original review because I haven't changed anything. So there's 3 people out there who've put in time and effort, and the authors haven't done anything with it. Instead, they just shop around and submit their manuscript again. So, okay, paper gets rejected, reviews are shared. And then the 3rd time, I get another review invitation, other journal, same story. Well, this is an extreme example. I've never had it this bad, but this is an extreme example. Don't think of it as a game. It's not like you've got your manuscript, people look at it, they put time and energy into it, and then, oh yeah, well, whatever, I want to try it another. It's a random draw. It's not a random draw.
Yeah. And yes, each time chances of the same reviewer are.
Yeah, of course. These are small fields. If you and I in the field of comparative cultural analysis do something, we sort of know what we're working on.
Yeah. So now everyone, I see that you're leaving a lot of comments. We have a setup that you may not see. Our monitors are very far, and I'm not sure if it's easy for me to read what you wrote. So
well, your eyes are better than mine, so
yeah.
you give it a try.
So let me see if there are any questions there. So hard to see. So maybe I'll not even try. So it's like 3 meters away, and it's hard to see, unfortunately. So anything else that you would like to add when it comes to publishing as an editor, as a reviewer, as an author, as a supervisor of PhD students?
Think of
maybe
it,
what do you wish? Oh, yes, you have a.
well, I think of it as it's almost like you're in the business of communication. You're trying to communicate something. So think of it as a way to become a member of a community where you're going to be engaging in a debate. And that's your publication is one thing. Your appearance at a conference is another thing. Your role as a reviewer is yet another role. But all these things, as a teacher, all these things have to do with the same underlying idea. You're part of an academic community where debate and different ways of the way debate is organized, that's central to what you're doing. And if you start to look at it that way, maybe that can also take away some of the obsession of, I need to get my publication, yes, that's important, but it's part of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is really be part of a conversation in the field that you like to work in, and that the topics and the phenomena that you really love.
Yeah. Karen, do you have any questions? I see one there.
No, I guess my question would be, as someone that's about to start getting more involved with publication, what do you see as, in the world of IB, really interesting phenomena that's coming across your desk?
Well, the world is changing so rapidly at the moment, and IB is smack in the center of it, right? So, I mean, what's going on in the world right now, economically, geopolitically, technologically, let's see how AI plays out. It's moving so fast, it's almost impossible to really say, well, this is where it's heading, or this is what we should be working on, or I'm the last person to give suggestions on what people should be working on, but because I think it should be bottom up. But this intersection of trying to understand what's going on, are we really at the brink of a new world order? And what does that mean for how firms are organized? What does it mean for how people communicate with one another? What does it mean for sort of layers of globalization and deglobalization? And unpacking that, I think, is really I think that's where IB scholars who love their field, I think that's what they're doing at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sense making.
Well, the geopolitical changes potentially can be actually good for us, because so many new things are happening that need to be explained. So in a way.
Yeah, well, I keep on telling my students, after 25 years of starting my undergrad by saying the world is globalizing, I'm saying borders are back.
Yeah.
And in a way that no one really could anticipate.
Well, a lot of opportunities for research. Collect your data as the world is changing so that you can write a longitudinal study.
Yeah, no, of course.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.